The meeting is already moving before you begin speaking. You lean forward, your voice measured and careful. You choose your words with absolute precision, building context, layering logic, and making sure nothing can possibly be misunderstood. Halfway through your sentence, it happens. A hand lifts slightly across the table. Not aggressive, not even rude, just decisive. You stop. The interruption is clean, efficient, and final. Someone else in the room, someone with higher standing without ever announcing it, summarizes your entire point in a single sentence. It is shorter, colder, and sharper. The room nods. Approval lands instantly. No one asks you to continue. For a moment, you feel like there has been a misunderstanding. You assume they didn't hear the full picture, that your clarity was cut short, and that if you had just finished explaining, the outcome would have been different. It is not only in boardrooms. It happens at dinner tables, in text threads that go quiet, in conversations where you feel the air shift before you have even finished your sentence. You explain your choices, you outline your reasoning, you present your evidence, and instead of the understanding you were hoping for, you receive polite distance, redirected attention, or a silence that tells you more than any response ever could. You finish speaking. Nothing changes. And somewhere in that gap between your effort and the outcome, a question begins to form. A quiet, uncomfortable question you have never quite allowed yourself to ask. But something has already shifted, something you haven't named yet. You've been told your entire life that clarity creates respect, that explaining yourself shows intelligence, and that precision earns authority. So you refine your words, you add detail, and every time you do, you feel more correct, more justified. Yet the room keeps responding the same way. Attention drops, interruptions increase, responses shorten, and slowly, without anyone announcing it, your position lowers. Why? Because in the framework of human psychology, understanding is not the currency of power, perception is. And perception does not reward effort, it measures positioning. In legal, business, and personal settings, over-explaining is an incredibly common phenomenon. It is also widely misunderstood. The habit is often treated as a clarity problem, as if the speaker is simply disorganized or unsure of the facts. In practice, the opposite is usually true. Over-explainers are frequently the most capable people in the room. They see the structure of an issue quickly, anticipate objections, and deeply understand nuance. Their mistake is not that they lack substance. Their mistake is that they keep adding substance long after the point has already been made. Communication is never only about information. It is also a status signal. Over-explaining signals, often unintentionally, that the speaker is seeking validation rather than setting direction. When a professional provides a conclusion and immediately begins to build a defensive case, they act as if they expect resistance. That frames the conversation as a challenge rather than a decision. Authority tends to be economical. The most effective leaders rarely walk a room through their reasoning unless explicitly asked. They state conclusions early, support them briefly, and stop. This is not posturing, it is a practical approach to influence. When you stop after a clear conclusion, you force the room to respond to the conclusion. When you continue talking, you give the room alternative targets. The conversation shifts from "what should we do?" to "is every single sentence you just spoke defensible?" Furthermore, extra caveats and clarifications import uncertainty into the record, making the speaker look defensive and inviting premature negotiation. Sociological research from Harvard Business School consistently demonstrates that high-status individuals in group settings use significantly less language to achieve significantly more influence. The variable is not eloquence, it is restraint. Researchers call this the talk time paradox. The more time a person spends justifying a position, the more the group reads them as uncertain about it. Conversely, a short, confident statement carries the implicit social encoding of someone who has already processed the full picture internally and has arrived at a clean output. The room does not reward your process, it rewards your conclusion. Intelligent people often fall into the over-explaining trap due to three primary psychological drivers. The first is intellectual empathy. Smart professionals are highly aware that other people may not share their mental map, so they try to be helpful by making that map explicit. The impulse is reasonable, but the execution overshoots. The second is risk management instincts. Many professionals are trained to identify edge cases and downside risk. The mistake is performing that entire risk assessment out loud, in real time, when the room only asked for a conclusion. Finally, there are early career reward systems. Junior professionals are rewarded for showing their work and proving competence through thoroughness. However, senior leaders are rewarded for judgment. If you continue speaking as if you are still proving you did the thinking, you fundamentally weaken your position. This creates a particularly cruel developmental trap. The habits that made you excellent at the beginning of your career, documenting your logic, showing every step, covering every angle, become the very habits that cap your advancement. The system does not warn you about this transition. Nobody sits you down and explains that the rules have changed. Instead, you simply keep doing what has always worked, and you begin to notice, slowly and with growing confusion, that it is no longer producing the same results. You are playing a game whose rules have quietly shifted beneath you. What is particularly invisible about this transition is that the feedback rarely comes directly. No one tells you that your explanations are too long, that your justifications are eroding your authority, that your precision is signaling anxiety rather than competence. Instead, the feedback arrives encoded, in the slight drop of eye contact when you begin your third qualifying sentence, in the way conversations seem to wrap up just as you hit your stride, in the quiet decisions made in rooms where your detailed reasoning was absent, but your reputation preceded you. You have to learn to read the room before the room stops bothering to communicate. To truly understand why over-explaining fails, we must look at how the human brain processes information, specifically through the lens of cognitive load theory. Educational psychologist John Sweller proposed that our working memory has severe limitations. Traditionally, working memory was thought to hold 5 to 9 bits of information at a time, but modern research suggests that number is actually closer to just 4 chunks of information. When we communicate, we place a cognitive load on our listener. This load is divided into 3 types. First is the intrinsic load, which is the inherent difficulty of the subject matter. Second is the germane load, which is the mental processing required to fit new material into existing mental schemas. But the third type is the enemy of effective communication, extraneous cognitive load. This refers to the mental effort spent on non-essential elements, distractions, or poorly presented information. When an intelligent person over-explains, adding unnecessary visual elements, overly wordy context, or redundant narratives, they drastically increase the listener's extraneous cognitive load. Because the brain's cognitive resources are limited, processing this extraneous load leaves the listener with less capacity to process the actual intrinsic value of the message. By trying to be incredibly thorough, the over-explainer literally overloads the listener's working memory, causing them to disengage, tune out, or become frustrated. Alan Pavio's dual coding theory adds another dimension to this problem. Human cognition processes verbal and visual information through 2 separate but interconnected channels, both of which have a finite capacity. When an explanation is dense with both complex language and abstract imagery, both channels saturate simultaneously. The listener does not simply fail to absorb the extra information. Their entire comprehension system degrades. They begin to experience what neurologists call information fatigue, a measurable drop in attention, emotional engagement, and retention. The over-explainer mistakes the listener's passive silence for receptivity. It is not receptivity, it is shutdown. This dynamic is compounded by a psychological phenomenon known as the curse of knowledge. When you know a thing deeply, it becomes incredibly difficult to imagine not knowing it. Highly intelligent individuals process variables via rapid heuristic shortcuts, instantly arriving at correct conclusions. However, they often assume their audience possesses the same baseline context. They jump straight into granular implementation details before even establishing the core problem. The expert is executing complex solutions, while the audience is still stuck in problem definition. As a result, the expert's meticulous explanation sounds like noise. This creates a severe cognitive misalignment. Ironically, individuals with less expertise can sometimes communicate much more effectively in group settings because they focus purely on simplicity and clarity rather than complex details. The rule is simple. If you can't explain it simply, you may understand it deeply, but your audience will not. Neuroscience imaging studies reveal what happens in the listener's brain during over-explanation. Within approximately 30 seconds of encountering information that exceeds their processing threshold, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for focused attention, begins to hand off activation to the default mode network. This is the brain's internal narrative system, responsible for daydreaming, self-referential thought, and mind-wandering. The listener has not chosen to stop paying attention. Their brain has made the choice automatically as a form of cognitive self-protection. By the time the speaker finishes their explanation, The listener has been mentally elsewhere for the majority of it, and they will never tell you. ACTIII, the illusion of explanatory depth and the Dunning-Kruger effect. But why does the audience push back? Why do listeners sometimes demand exhaustive explanations, only to reject them? The answer lies in two fascinating cognitive biases. The first is the illusion of explanatory depth, or IOED. Coined by Yale researchers Leonid Rosenblatt and Frank Cale in 2002, this illusion reveals that people consistently believe they understand complex causal systems far better than they actually do. Take the bicycle test. If you ask 10 adults to draw a bicycle from memory, most will produce drawings that physically cannot work. Missing chains, impossible frame geometry, or wheels disconnected from pedals. We walk through life believing we understand how zippers, toilets, and complex corporate strategies work. We mistake our superficial familiarity with a system for a deep understanding of its operations. This illusion is driven by factors like change blindness and the illusion of levels, believing that because we can name the parts of a computer, we understand how those parts function together. This pairs dangerously with the Dunning-Kruger effect. David Dunning and Justin Kruger demonstrated that people of low to moderate competence drastically overestimate their abilities. They suffer from a double burden of incompetence or a metacognitive lack. They are not only unskilled, but they lack the very expertise required to recognize that they are unskilled. In a famous 1999 study, Dunning and Kruger observed the case of MacArthur Wheeler, a bank robber who disguised himself by covering his face with lemon juice. His rationale: lemon juice is used as invisible ink, therefore it should render him invisible to security cameras. He was genuinely shocked when he was caught. He lacked the mental capabilities to figure out the gap in his own reasoning. What makes this especially relevant to the overexplainer is the mechanism of confirmation bias. When a listener holds an oversimplified model of reality, new information does not automatically update that model. Instead, the brain selectively filters incoming data to confirm what it already believes. The expert's nuanced explanation is not evaluated on its merits. It is filtered through the listener's pre-existing framework, stripped of complexity, and reduced to something that fits the listener's current mental map. The most precise explanation in the world cannot override a bias the listener does not know they have. This is not a failure of the speaker's clarity. It is a structural feature of the human mind. There's a quiet but profound liberation that comes from truly accepting this. The expert who has spent years trying to bridge the comprehension gap, meeting resistance not with frustration, but with yet more explanation, more evidence, more carefully constructed argument, eventually arrives at a crossroads. They can continue pouring energy into a container that cannot hold it, or they can redirect that energy toward the people who are already equipped to receive it. The highest leverage choice an intelligent person can make is not explaining better. It is explaining less to the wrong people and more to the right ones. Selectivity is not elitism, it is conservation. And once you truly understand why the gap exists, you stop blaming yourself for the inability to close it, and you start choosing your audience with far more care. When an intelligent expert tries to explain a complex system to a less competent audience, they face a wall of metacognitive blindness. The unskilled listener is literally blind to the qualitative differences between their own simplistic model and the expert's nuanced reality. Furthermore, cognitive science shows that when you ask someone to justify their position, their beliefs become more extreme and polarized. Realizing this asymmetry of comprehension, the intellectually mature individual recognizes that over-explaining is often a futile expenditure of cognitive resources. You cannot explain someone out of an illusion they don't know they are in. So, the intelligent person chooses to let their actions and time speak instead. ACTIV, the trauma of over-explaining, the fawn response. But there is a darker, more vulnerable reason why people over-explain. For many, the historical urge to over-explain does not stem from a desire to showcase intelligence. It stems from survival. It traces back to childhood environments where unpredictability was the norm. When a person grows up in a home where their words are twisted, dismissed, or used against them, learning to over-justify becomes a vital survival skill. In psychology, this is recognized as the fawn response, the fourth lesser-known trauma response alongside fight, flight, and freeze. Coined by psychotherapist Pete Walker, fawning is a trauma-driven pattern of people-pleasing behaviors designed to diffuse danger when the brain senses a relational threat. When a child cannot fight back or flee from an emotionally volatile caregiver, the nervous system gets creative. It learns to appease. It learns to manage the emotional state of the abuser to secure safety. Verbal fawning manifests as chronic over-explaining. If you grew up with inconsistent rules, walking on eggshells, or being chronically disbelieved and gaslit, you learned that your word alone was never enough. You started gathering exhaustive evidence, providing excessive detail, and anticipating every counterargument before an accusation was even made. You learned to build an airtight case that couldn't be dismissed. The logic is rooted in fear. If I can just explain myself perfectly, maybe they won't get angry, maybe I will be safe. In adulthood, this trauma plays out in slow motion. It looks like writing a 4-paragraph email to explain why you need to leave work 30 minutes early. It looks like over-apologizing and feeling responsible for other people's emotions. From a polyvagal theory perspective, the fawn response is an exceptionally draining physiological state. It activates both the sympathetic nervous system, providing the anxious energy to meet others' needs, and the dorsal vagal circuit, causing emotional dissociation to shield the psyche. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory gives us a precise language for what is happening in the body during this process. The person in a fawn response is operating from a state of chronic sympathetic activation, meaning their nervous system is stuck in a low-grade emergency. The heart rate is slightly elevated. The muscles are tense. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making and impulse regulation, is partially offline, overridden by the survival imperative of the limbic system. In this state, the individual is not choosing to over-explain. They are being driven to over-explain by a nervous system that has learned, through repeated early experience, that thorough justification is the price of safety. The explanations are not communication. They are appeasement rituals. Over-explaining in this context is an anxiety-driven need for certainty. Ambiguity destabilizes the nervous system, so the individual explains endlessly, hoping to regulate their own internal distress. But the tragedy is that this pattern attracts exactly the type of people who will exploit it. Manipulators and toxic individuals recognize the over-explainer immediately. They see someone who will work tirelessly to manage their feelings. And they use the over-explainer's need to be understood as leverage. They keep the person in the explaining position, justifying, softening, working for approval. Because as long as the victim is explaining, the manipulator holds the power. Healing begins when an individual stops treating their choices like a courtroom case. A major psychological milestone is reached when a person recognizes that a boundary does not require an explanation. Personal boundaries get dismantled one explanation at a time. The habit of justifying your choices to people who did not earn a say is self-negotiation in public, disguised as communication. When you state a boundary and attach a reason to it, you turn it into a negotiation. The moment you say, "I can't come because I'm tired and have a lot going on," you hand the other person a lever to argue against your fatigue. Firm boundaries sound declarative. "I cannot do that." Eroded boundaries sound apologetic. In modern relational discourse, we are implicitly taught that talking things through is always the mark of emotional maturity. Silence or refusal to engage is treated with suspicion, often labeled as stonewalling or manipulation. But this ignores a fundamental truth. Communication requires consent. Disengagement is not the absence of communication. It is a profound form of communication. It communicates limits, capacity, and the withdrawal of consent. When an intellectually mature individual disengages, they do so not to punish, but to protect their own nervous system and cognitive bandwidth. They realize that clarity is not always required to respect a boundary. In fact, an ethical response to someone disengaging is simply stopping the pursuit. Continuing to push for an explanation after a person has signaled a limit is no longer an attempt at mutual understanding. It is a boundary violation, an act of overriding autonomy. When you stop justifying your right to exist, you discover that peace lives on the other side of an explanation. You learn that access to your inner world is not a right. It is a privilege that people must earn. By withholding explanations from those who seek only to control or argue, you let silence act as a mirror. Silence makes people reveal themselves. The person who is full of bitterness will let it spill out. The person driven by jealousy will expose their insecurity. And all of this happens without you saying a single word. There is a particular kind of freedom that arrives when you fully internalize this truth. It is not a cold freedom, not the freedom of indifference or detachment. It is the warm, quiet freedom of a person who has learned to distinguish between those who want to understand them and those who want to control them. These two categories of people look identical at first. They both ask the same questions. They both push back with equal conviction. The difference only reveals itself in how they respond when you stop explaining. Those who wanted to understand you will accept the boundary. Those who wanted to control you will escalate. Your silence is the test. Their response is the answer. Over time, you learn to read this response with remarkable precision. The person who pushes back gently, gives you space, and eventually adjusts their behavior. They were always in the first category. The person who escalates, demands justification, weaponizes your silence against you, or characterizes your boundary as aggression. They have just told you everything you needed to know. You did not need a conversation for this revelation. You simply needed the patience to stop talking long enough to let their true nature surface. Silence, in this way, is not passive. It is diagnostic. It extracts the truth from a situation with a precision that no amount of direct questioning ever could. Because people lie in response to questions, but they reveal themselves in response to silence. Across every culture and every hierarchy, silence has always functioned as a currency of power. Not the silence of ignorance or defeat, but the deliberate, chosen silence of someone who has already decided. In social ecosystems governed by status, ambiguity is not weakness, it is leverage. Communication researchers describe this as strategic ambiguity, the practice of leaving key information unstated to preserve optionality and maintain interpretive control. High-status individuals in negotiation settings deploy this instinctively. They do not explain their reasoning. They state outcomes. They do not justify their positions. They anchor them. And because the other party cannot fully read their logic, they cannot effectively challenge it. You cannot dismantle a position whose foundations you cannot see. This is why the most experienced negotiators in the world are trained to master the long pause. After an offer is made, after a position is stated, after a demand is delivered, the strategic communicator says nothing and waits. The silence is unbearable for the anxious mind. And in that discomfort, the over-explainer begins to fill the void. They offer concessions they hadn't planned to offer. They soften positions they had meant to hold. They give away information they intended to protect. All because silence felt like rejection, and they were trained, by fear, by habit, by years of justifying their existence, to resolve discomfort by talking. The psychology of strategic withholding is rooted in a simple truth. The human imagination, when deprived of information, will fill the gap. And what it imagines is almost always more impressive, more intimidating, more compelling than anything you could have said directly. When you over-explain, you replace that imagination with your words. You hand the listener a fully assembled picture, and in doing so, you eliminate the gap where respect, curiosity, and authority tend to live. The most compelling people in any room are rarely the ones who have said the most. They are the ones who seem to be holding something back. This is not manipulation. It is simply an understanding of how human social cognition operates. The brain is a pattern completion machine. It is always generating predictions, always trying to complete the picture. When a high-status communicator speaks sparingly, the listener's brain does not register this as a lack of depth. It registers it as intentional restraint. And intentional restraint reads as mastery. Mastery reads as authority. Authority generates the one thing no explanation can buy: automatic trust. The most secure individuals you will ever meet share one behavioral trait. They are entirely comfortable not being understood. They do not require your comprehension to feel certain of their value. They do not need your agreement to maintain their conviction. They have made peace with the fundamental human truth that some people will never understand you, some people are not meant to, and some people are actively choosing not to, and none of that changes who you are. This is not arrogance. It is the final, quiet form of self-respect. This transition from a compulsion to explain to a structured, deliberate silence is a massive developmental milestone. It represents the achievement of what family systems theorist Murray Bowen called the differentiation of self. Differentiation of self has two components: internal and interpersonal. Internally, it is the ability to separate your logical thoughts from your emotional reactions. Highly differentiated individuals have low emotional reactivity. They don't panic when faced with criticism. They establish an I position. They can state their beliefs calmly without yielding to the pressure of group disapproval. Interpersonally, they can balance intimacy and autonomy. They don't fall into emotional fusion, where the individual is swallowed by the group, acting as a chameleon to gain approval. Their self-esteem is internally stable. They distinguish between ich, the I, and nishtik, the not I, operating with boundaries that act like a healthy, semi-permeable cell membrane rather than a rigid wall. This high level of differentiation usually coalesces in midlife. Around the age of 40, many people quietly, suddenly stop justifying their decisions. In your 20s and 30s, explaining yourself serves a function. You are testing your values against peer reactions, using their responses as external mirrors to build your identity. But as you enter your 40s, developmental psychology notes a shift from identity versus role confusion to generativity versus stagnation. The central existential question changes from "who am I?" to "what am I building?" This psychological pivot is backed by hard neuroscience. In midlife, the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive control center, finishes its structural refinement, while the amygdala, the brain's threat detection alarm, cools down and becomes less reactive to social friction. Your brain no longer interprets a difference of opinion as a life-or-death existential threat. Furthermore, psychologist Laura Carstenson's socio-emotional selectivity theory explains that as we perceive our remaining time decreasing, we prune peripheral social networks. We stop spending our precious cognitive bandwidth on performative behaviors and broad social approval, prioritizing deep emotional meaning instead. You realize you don't need 20 acquaintances to validate your life choices. You only need 2 people who genuinely understand you. This is also heavily influenced by natural temperament. Hans Eysenk's arousal theory of introversion shows that introverts, who represent a massive portion of deep analytical thinkers, have a higher baseline of brain arousal. Extra social noise, repetitive small talk, and the demand to constantly explain oneself feel rapidly overwhelming. For these intellectually mature individuals, silence is not social anxiety. It is an active mechanism to restore homeostatic balance. It is highly efficient energy management. Erik Erikson's framework of psychosocial development describes this phase as the tension between generativity and stagnation. Those who achieve generativity turn their energy outward, toward mentorship, creation, and contribution, rather than inward toward self-justification and approval-seeking. They are no longer auditioning for a role in the social hierarchy. They are building something. And people who are building something do not have time to explain themselves to people who are not contributing to the construction. Their silence is not withdrawal. It is allocation. Every word they withhold from a pointless justification is a word they invest into something that matters. There is an invisible architecture that the most respected people in any room have quietly built over years, not through grand explanations of who they are, but through the consistent, unannounced alignment between what they say and what they do. This architecture is called earned trust, and it is the only form of credibility that cannot be argued against, because it was never built with arguments. Earned trust works through a mechanism that psychologists call behavioral consistency. When a person repeatedly makes decisions that align with stated values, without drama, without ceremony, without commentary, the brain of the observer begins to develop what researchers term a predictive model of that person. In social psychology, this predictive model is the foundation of deep credibility. It is stronger than any endorsement, more convincing than any explanation, and more durable than any reputation you could construct through words alone. Because it was not constructed at all. It was simply observed. The paradox of the proven track record is this: the more you have actually done, the less you need to explain yourself. Execution is, in its purest form, the final argument. Every completed project, every promise kept, every difficulty navigated without complaint accumulates in the memory of the people around you. They are keeping score without telling you, and their scorecard does not measure how eloquently you justified your choices. It measures the distance between what you said you would do and what you actually did. This is why the most trusted people in any organization are often the quietest, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have already said everything that matters in the language that cannot be argued with: action. When they speak, people lean in, not because they command the room with volume or force, but because experience has taught the room that when this particular person chooses to speak, it is worth listening. Their silence has created the conditions for their words to land. The economy of their communication has inflated the value of every sentence they release. Consider the surgeon who walks into a crisis without announcing their competence. They do not say, "I have performed this procedure 400 times. I graduated at the top of my program. Here is my full reasoning." They simply begin. Their hands move with the kind of precision that tells the room everything. In that moment, an explanation would be an insult, not to the audience, but to the truth. What they have done speaks so clearly that anything they might say would only dilute it. The same principle operates in every domain of human interaction. The parent who has always shown up does not need to explain that they care. The partner who has never broken a promise does not need to announce their loyalty. The colleague who has always delivered does not need to pre-defend their next proposal. Their history is their argument. Their record is their language. And that language is the one that silence can never undermine, because it was never built with silence. It was built with years of showing up. This is the final, deepest reason why intelligent people stop explaining themselves. It is not cynicism. It is clarity. They have understood that the most persuasive thing they can do in any room, any relationship, any negotiation, is to continue to be exactly who they have always been, and to let the record of that identity speak with a precision that no explanation can match. So, how does one systematically stop over-explaining? How do you step out of the autopilot trap and reclaim your cognitive bandwidth? It requires practicing the architecture of silence. The first tool is the pause method. When you feel the anxious surge to justify yourself, you must pause before speaking. Ask yourself, did they actually request this explanation, or am I trying to soothe my own anxiety? Use a breath to create physical space and lower your cortisol. Speak the shortest, most minimal version of your truth. End there, even if it feels incomplete. Let the silence hang in the air. The second tool is the relational rule of 3. A mature individual will explain their perspective or boundary once to casual associates, twice to close friends, and at most 3 times to a romantic partner. If the other party still fails to demonstrate genuine understanding after 3 attempts, they are actively choosing not to understand so they do not have to alter their own behavior. At this point, explaining becomes begging, and the mature choice is to completely disengage. The third tool is delivering the decision without the defense. I decided not to attend. I am leaving this job. I am ending this relationship. The facts are complete sentences on their own. Keep the delivery warm, but the content complete. The warmth preserves the relationship. The brevity preserves the boundary. And finally, before you speak in a high-stakes setting, ask yourself one question. Would I be comfortable seeing this exact explanation repeated back to me in writing? If the answer is no, do not say it. It is likely unnecessary padding that will only weaken your position. There is a 5th tool that sits quietly beneath all the others, and it may be the most powerful of all, the practice of letting outcomes speak for you. When you have made a correct decision, time will validate it. When you have chosen the right path, the results will confirm it. The over-explainer tries to win the argument before the outcome arrives. The strategically silent person makes the decision, executes it, and lets reality do the arguing. This is not passivity. This is the deepest form of confidence available to a human being, the willingness to wait, without justification, for truth to surface on its own. When you stop justifying your choices to people who chronically push your boundaries, you reclaim an immense amount of emotional and cognitive energy. You spend less time rehearsing, defending, or recovering. You stop auditioning for roles in other people's dramas. Over time, a profound internal shift occurs. You begin healing the part of you that believed love, safety, and respect had to be earned through exhaustive explanation. You learn that your worth was never conditional on your ability to be perfectly persuasive. You realize that not everyone has earned access to your inner world. You build an inner circle of people who do not need to be convinced, and outside that circle you speak less, stand firmer, and give away nothing you haven't consciously chosen to share. The strongest people don't spend their lives proving who they are. They spend their lives becoming who they were meant to be. Your life is not a courtroom, and you are not on trial. The next time you feel the urge to layer logic, to soften your edges, to explain your right to exist, stop, state your truth, and let the silence do the heavy lifting. In practical terms, this transformation does not announce itself. There is no single day when you wake up and decide you are done explaining. It is more gradual than that. It begins with small choices, the text you draft and then delete, the defense you prepare and then decide not to deliver, the meeting where you state your position once and let it stand. Each of these micro-decisions is a small withdrawal from the economy of justification and a small deposit into the account of self-respect. Over months and years, these deposits accumulate into something that changes the fundamental texture of your relationships. The people who needed your constant explanation in order to feel comfortable with you begin to fall away. This does not happen dramatically. It happens the way seasons change, gradually and then all at once. And the people who remain, the ones who are still there after the silence, are the ones who never needed the explanation in the first place. They saw you clearly without it. What replaces the constant verbal labor of self-justification is something that the over-explainer rarely imagines is possible: a quality of presence. When you are no longer spending your cognitive resources on constructing defenses, managing others' perceptions, and pre-answering objections that have not even been raised, you become available, fully, genuinely available, to the moment in front of you. You hear what people are actually saying, not just the threat concealed in their words. You respond to what is real, not to what you feared they might mean. This is the quiet revolution that happens inside the person who has stopped explaining. From the outside, they may seem colder, more distant, less effusive, harder to read. But from the inside, the experience is precisely the opposite. It is warmer, it is richer, it is steadier, because you are no longer performing yourself for an audience. You are simply being yourself in the only moment that has ever been real, this one. The world does not need more explanations. It is already full of them, thorough, well-reasoned, precisely articulated explanations that land on deaf ears and closed minds every single day. What the world is short of is people who have the courage to act from their values without a press release. People who can sit with being misunderstood, who can function without unanimous approval, who have learned to locate their authority somewhere deeper than other people's agreement. That is what this is ultimately about. Not silence as a strategy, not brevity as a performance, but the lived reality of a person who has separated their identity from others' comprehension of it. A person who is whole whether or not they are understood. A person whose peace does not depend on your permission. Because the end of over-explaining is not the end of connection. It is the beginning of real connection. When you stop performing understanding for people who were never truly listening, you create space, real space, for the people who were. The conversations that follow are different, shorter, yes, but each word carries genuine weight because it was chosen deliberately rather than discharged anxiously. The silences between your words stop feeling like failures and start feeling like punctuation. Intentional. Yours. Because true confidence does not need an explanation, and true peace lives on the other side of silence.